Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope everyone's been enjoying their summer over the past few weeks. First off, thanks to all of you who've been listening and supporting the series, and to those of you who've kindly been in touch to say how much you're enjoying the podcast. That means a lot, so thank you. Thanks also to the wonderful patrons over on Patreon who helped to make this series possible. And a quick shout out to the new patrons, Philip and Branches of Bucker. I really appreciate the support, so thank you. I also have to say thanks to everyone who's come along to the recent talks at the Polly in Falmouth and at the Cornwall Folk Festival. It was lovely to see you there. And over the coming weeks, as we move into autumn, if you're interested in hearing about the darker side of Cornwall's past, then I have the full dates for my talk exploring dark tales of Cornish smuggling. So you can catch the talk at the Castle in Bude on the 3rd of September, Borderlands Festival in Launceston on the 20th of September, Trelissick Garden on the 14th of October, Cornwall Museum Art Gallery in the afternoon of the 15th of October, and on the evening of the 15th I'll be at the Polly in Falmouth, the Acorn in Penzance on the 22nd of October, here in my home village of Tywardreath on the 23rd of October, and finally into Bodmin on the 24th of October. That's quite a few dates, I know, to bombard you with there. But fear not, you can find all the details and links to tickets for each of those events in the show notes. Right, now all the business side of things is out of the way, let's crack on with the episode. A little while back last year, I put together an episode called Tales from the Crossroads, where we explored the historical practice of crossroads burial, whereby certain people, for various reasons, might be buried outside of the parish in unconsecrated ground, and some of the folklore that becomes attached to these kind of sites in the landscape that are often described as liminal places, sites on the edge of towns and villages, sometimes wild, lonely and isolated spots. The history of crossroads burial continues to fascinate me, partly because we have this wealth of folklore and local tales attached to these sites. And that's why I was excited to hear a few months back that writer and friend of the podcast, Elizabeth Dale, aka The Cornish Bird, had written a new book called Buried at the Crossroads, which I highly recommend, and I'll pop a link in the show notes if you want to get yourself a copy. With the release of the book, I thought this would be a great opportunity to revisit the topic in more detail, to chat about the book, the research and how the project came together, and to discuss some of the stories, themes, and the local history that we can expect to find in the book. So in this episode, you're going to be hearing from my recent conversation with Elizabeth Dale as we delve into this topic. And I should say that the themes we'll be exploring can be quite dark and macabre, with references to violence and suicide. If that's perhaps not for you, you might perhaps want to check out one of the other episodes in the series. Otherwise, without further waffle, here's our next episode, Buried at the Crossroads. The common people in Cornwall will not be persuaded, even at this day, but that there is something more than ordinary at such places. and their stories of apparitions gain greater credit if the spirit, demon or hobgoblin, is said to have appeared where 4 lanes meet. There they think apparitions are most frequent, and at such places it is common for these people travelling in the dark to be the most afraid. A quote there from William Borlase writing back in 1752 about the local beliefs and superstitions surrounding Crossroads. Since ancient times, the crossroads and roadsides have been used as places of burial for those deemed to be criminals, those who had sadly taken their own lives, or for whatever reason had essentially been cast out and deliberately buried outside of the parish or on the parish boundaries. You get the sense that people were uneasy at the thought of having to pass through these places at night. Often folklore, particularly things like ghost stories, might spring up surrounding these places. A famous example of this is Jay's grave up on Dartmoor, the site of an alleged Crossroads burial from a couple of centuries ago, when a poor young woman variously known as Kitty J or Mary J was said to have taken her own life after being abandoned once she had fallen pregnant. According to tradition, she was buried at the Crossroads, and over the years there have been stories of a ghostly figure seen near the grave and at the Crossroads. Historically, those who had committed certain crimes might be gibbeted, as it was known, their bodies placed in a cage or put on display as a warning to others, often at places like a crossroads. And there are stories that in 1685, after the failed Monmouth Rebellion, following what became known as the Bloody Assizes, presided over by the infamous Judge Jeffreys, many of the rebels were executed and then displayed at locations across the southwest. Cornwall-based writer Barbara Spooner, writing back in the 1970s, wrote of some of the traditions passed on to her by the locals, and she says, and I quote, "They also say men who had killed others were buried at Crossroads. And at Isaac's Turning in North Hill, a man was buried there who had been hanged for sheep stealing." So it's a dark part of our history, but something that's always intrigued me. And recently I sat down to chat about it further with writer, blogger and podcaster Elizabeth Dale, whose new book, Buried at the Crossroads, explores the history of Crossroads burial here in Cornwall, and some of the themes that go alongside it. And we dove straight in to talking about the book.
I mean, I've tried to include as many stories and cases as I possibly could. Some of them I've a lot of information on, and some of them I've hardly got anything at all. But it's a subject that I feel is so little talked about and little written about that I wanted to make sure the book covered as much as possible, whether I could 100% verify things or not. I wanted as much of it in there as possible because, you know, for me, it's a subject that, is so little known about, really. I mean, since I published the book, and you speak to people and they either had absolutely no clue whatsoever that, you know, being buried at a crossroads was a thing, or they thought it was just something sort of from myths, you know, that wasn't actually real.
Is it one of those things that you kind of go, that you kind of find interesting enough that you'll probably always want to keep researching a little bit on the side because it's of interest, sort of thing?
I have a couple of little things that I've, since it's now in print, I've gone like, oh, I should have put that little note with this. And so there's potential in the future of going back to it and like adding a little bit to it and updating it, I suppose, a little bit. But I do genuinely think that it's just one of those weird or dark aspects of our history that has generally been kind of overlooked because it's uncomfortable to talk about and to think about, and as much now as it was kind of when it was happening, I suppose.
What do you think? It's a big question. It's probably one that we've talked about in the past, but I suppose what really drew you to the project and the idea of creating the book, and what I guess, yeah, what fascinated you about that sort of subject matter, I suppose?
So the first story that I came across was the lady that was buried at the Four Parish Stone. And I literally just came across a newspaper article when I was looking for something else. And I made a note of it because it struck me as really unusual. And I didn't quite understand what I was reading, I suppose. But then it just lived in my notebook for a long time. But I kept revisiting it in my head and thinking, I must look into that. I must try and find out what that was about. Because I was completely ignorant, really. I'd heard of Crossroads burials, but I thought it was only people who had been executed at a gallows, because gallows were quite often on Crossroads. So I just assumed that a Crossroads burial was literally just people who had been executed and buried, beside the execution site. So it was that initial story of the woman at the Four Parish Stone, which was in August 1813. And I decided that I wanted to find out more about her story and try and find out who she was and why, this action had been taken. And that just led me down a massive rabbit hole of why Crossroads burials occurred, and the superstitions and the traditions and everything around that. And then subsequently coming across other stories of people that had been buried beside the highway or at a crossroads. And then that just led me to think about, the burials that are in the landscape that are completely forgotten about. And I say, like in my blurb on the back of the book, that this might change the way that you look at the Cornish countryside forever, because that's what it's done for me, is that now there are places that I have driven past my entire life, and I've now found out that that's a site where people were traditionally, buried. So it was just a snowball effect, really. It started with that one woman's story, and then it just kept growing and growing from that. Initially, I have to say, I was quite apprehensive about publishing it in a book, because I do realize that it's quite an uncomfortable kind of subject, and quite a morbid subject. And for some reason, Keith, because I'm not a morbid person, but I seem to be drawn to these dark parts of our history. I don't know, I'm like a moth to the flame when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Well, I have to say, I'm really glad that you did put this book together and you did publish it, because I feel the same. I don't know why. I think for me, it's almost like solving a mystery or problem solving, or trying to find out about these aspects of history that are often not talked about, or whatever, for various reasons, or from my perspective, how folklore develops around these things. But I think you're absolutely right. Ever since, probably a little bit before I read the book, but more so since reading the book, there's I don't look at Crossroads in the same way.
No.
There's one that I pass. So me and my mate Ken, shout out to Ken. We have jam sessions where we play music over at his place, which is just over from Tywardreath. But to walk there, I walk along the back lanes sometimes at night. But you pass a particular crossroads, and I know of no stories or anything attached to them. But now places like that in the landscape, it's easy to see how you're walking there at night, I don't know, 150, 200 years ago, you'd see those places in the landscape differently. And now I kind of do.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. And I had an email actually only a few days ago from, I don't know if you know, Peter Herring. He's a landscape archaeologist, and he's like the president now of Cornwall Archaeological Society, I think. Anyway, he bought the book and read it, and he said the same. Actually, he brought up the point to me, which is what I had kind of tried to get across in the book, but without sort of being too obvious about it, but that every parish must have had a place where they buried this, for want of a better word, outcast dead, the people that they couldn't bury in consecrated ground. Every parish, or at least, within 2 or 3 parishes, they must have all have had these places traditionally where these people were buried. And he said to me, it's just sort of hit him that there must be so many more out there that we don't know exist, and there's a sort of, without trying to sound too touchy-feely, there's a sort of sensitivity then to the landscape when you're walking, like the Four Parishes stone. To be frank, I've walked past that stone hundreds of times and I didn't even notice the stone, let alone the connections that it has, and the heritage that's, on that like one spot of crossroads of paths. And so it's just taken on a completely different kind of connotations for me. And I think that connecting yourself to the landscape in that way is it's interesting, and it's kind of emotional in a lot of ways, and that was another reason that I wanted to write the book, is that I became, I'm not sure obsessed is the right word, but really conscious of the fact that there were all these people who, for various reasons, had been buried away from communities, away from their societies, had been completely ostracized. And not only that, they have now been completely forgotten about. Their lives just don't exist, So I was really conscious of the fact that I wanted to give them back, a bit of agency and a bit of give them back their story in a way, and tell people that they existed and they are there. And, so that was another reason that I really wanted to sort of publish it as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important, because sometimes you're dealing with real individuals who did exist. And there's that, I guess, duty of care to want to do justice to their story, and I guess to try and tell it in a sort of the sensitive way and in the right way.
Maybe we should make it a bit more, because obviously I've just become aware that listeners, obviously they haven't read the book. So just to lay it out for people, it wasn't just criminals that were buried at Crossroads. It was people that had been accused of witchcraft, but it was also anyone who had died by suicide, who had died by their own hand. They were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground up until 1823, when the law was eventually changed. But even then, it was kind of down to the discretion of each individual vicar as to whether he would allow that to happen even then. So for hundreds of years, anyone who took their own life would be buried at a crossroads, or beside a highway, or on some random patch of ground.
And I think what I find fascinating that instantly drew me in was this story around the Four Parishes stone, because I had no idea. I wasn't aware of it at all, but I love the fact that you talk about how we have these sites in the landscape, and you don't realize that they obviously have different uses as well over time. You kind of mentioned how it became a sort of meeting point for lovers as well at one point, and that's such a different thing, but also in a way it's a lovely thing, because it means these places aren't also just dark, sort of places, but they also there's life going on around these places in the landscape too.
The Four Parishes stone, it's one of those, like you say, one of those strange places in the landscape where it has all different kinds of connotations over the centuries. It's basically in the butt end of nowhere on the Penwith Moors, but it's a place where a number of different routes cross, and some of these routes are prehistoric routes, so they've been there for an extremely long time. And there's a couple of legends connected to the stone, but given all that's in the landscape around it, so you've got Carn Galva, you've got Menontoll, you've got Menskryfer, you've got, you know, barrows and quoits and all kinds of things going on. Why this one particular boulder, for want of a better word, was chosen as the crossing point of four parishes. So the reason it's called the Four Parishes Stone is because four parishes meet at it. So you've got Morva, Madron, Golval, and Zena, and they all sort of converge, their boundaries converge at this stone. And very often crossroads burials would be not only on a crossroad of paths or roads, they would also be on a crossroads of these parish boundaries, or even there's a place outside Scoria called Ceverango, and that was a crossing point for the hundreds, you know, the ancient divisions of Cornwall that were known as hundreds. So so it's a very sort of important site, but very unassuming. So as I said, I've walked past it 100 times and it just looks like a rock.
Yeah.
So and I go into, in the book, I go into a little bit more about, you know, the legends that are associated with it, which some of them are quite far-fetched. And then there's also this lovely sort of idea that it was what in Cornish is called a trysting place, where, you know, because it's isolated, I suppose, so young lovers, if they wanted to have a clandestine meeting, they'd go out to this rock in the, you know, in the middle, the butt end of nowhere on the Penwith Moors for their liaison. But its isolation also led to a suggestion that there should be some kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Isolation hospital built there. So there's like a ruin of an old cottage. And there was a suggestion in the 19th century that, you know, anyone that had something nasty, you know, cholera or scarlet fever or whatever should be carted off and left out on the moors to either get better or not. So yeah, it's the more I looked into this very unassuming location, the more I found out about it. And then, you know, to think as well that this one woman is buried there, but potentially many more people are buried there, because I can't believe that in 1813 that she was the first person to have been buried at this particular spot. I imagine, though I cannot prove and I do not know, but I imagine that it would have been, for those parishes, it would have been the traditional place to go and bury their outcast dead.
Well, I wondered if this is just a theory that's kind of sprung to mind, really, whether it's something that you've come across any kind of indication or evidence for. But I also wonder whether the places like these are the kind of landmarks. They're places that everyone locally might be aware of it. I will meet you at such and such a place because it's a local landmark. So if you are two lovers trying to meet in secret, I'll meet you there at this time or this hour of the day. I also wonder if these places might have been places that, if they are between sort of parish boundaries, whether people would meet so certain things would be decided. I know, like the Saxons were doing certain things like that. We meet at this tree.
Yeah.
Certain things to be decided. So I wonder if they served also other purposes. So they kind of are this weird place that maybe punishments are meted out at these places, but also decisions are made about these places as well. It's just a theory of getting thought of.
No, I mean, that's not actually something that I had come across or thought about, but actually makes perfect sense, especially if you were trying to come to some kind of legal agreement over something. Because the thing about crossroads, particularly these ones which are where the boundaries of parishes meet, is that they're these very liminal spaces. They're kind of almost like a no man's land, because, you know, before like satellite GPS. You know, if you are standing there, how do you know which parish you are standing in? You could be in any of the four. You know, there's no sort of there's no line drawn on the ground that distinguishes one place from another. And that was the part of the reason that these places were chosen, which I think we'll get into a little bit more later. But yeah, that, as I said, an interesting idea. I kind of get how that would work, but I haven't actually come across any reference to that. So yeah, but interesting thought.
No, it's just one that suddenly sprung to mind. But I've also, it started my brain sort of the cogs turning, thinking I can think of two sites up the road from me. So one, you'll probably know both of them. That says Castle Door. You've got a natural crossroads there where you could go over towards Gallant or go right towards Foy or left towards sort of Lostwithiel and Lanlivery. But further along, there's a place I think it's called Four Turnings, as if you're going towards Foy. But you've got the Tristan Stone there.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
some of these ideas kind of are sort of similarly linked in many ways because, you know, in folklore, you've got this idea that the Tristan Stone is said to be, you know, mark where Tristan, in sort of Arthurian legend, Tristan and Isolde is kind of said to be buried. But I wonder if these are kind of linked with sort of way crosses.
Keith, there's so much, like, my mind was blown away by the amount of stuff that I was finding out when I started researching this, because wayside crosses is a whole other thing as well, because they were used to mark, you know, places in the landscape, hence the wayside. You know, they were guiding you on your way. They were also kind of like a spiritual guide as well. You know, there's sort of a designated sign, a symbol of the faith, you know, in the landscape. And they were very often positioned at crossroads. And there's another theory around crossroads burials that they were. It's a kind theory as to why crossroads were chosen for places for these burials, because from above, a crossroads creates the sign of a cross and the Christian symbol, obviously. So it was sort of the nearest thing to consecrated ground that you could get if you weren't in a churchyard. And also very often there was these wayside crosses as well, which, you know, would stand as almost like a memorial. But I think that's quite a generous way of looking at it. But yes, that, you know, again, you know, they are wayside crosses is a whole other thing around that. We could go on for hours. Yeah.
I think the more you think about it, the more complicated these sites become, because they seem to be used for. That's an interesting theory I hadn't thought of at all when it comes to sort of, you know, wayside crosses and way crosses and those sites. But also you've got these sites that are sort of being used for people who are have sadly taken their own lives, but also used as a kind of to serve as a reminder for those who have committed crimes as well. That, and I'm sort of separating this here by what I deem crimes in terms of theft or things like that, where people are made an example of with like gibbeting, for example. You've got all of these things happening at the same sites, so they are sort of multi-usage sites in many ways.
If the more you start thinking about crossroads, the more complicated it gets, is what I find. And I devote a whole kind of chapter in the book as trying to work out why crossroads were singled out. As I said, there were occasions where people were just buried literally beside the highway, is what they called it. And it was a sentence that was handed down by the coroner, basically, you know. And but crossroads, there is just layer upon layer upon layer, because of course there's all the sort of the dark arts and witchcraft associations with crossroads as well, going back again to this kind of liminal space. So, you know, there's William Painter, you know, the guy that wrote quite a lot about Cornish witchcraft. He touches upon it in one of his books and talks about how witches would use crossroads as places to cast spells and curses and things like that. And William Borlase, he also talks about how Cornish people see Crossroads as places that are outside the ordinary, that they're these sort of, these odd places where you'll find demons and piskies and, creatures from myth and legend. They're quite often associated. The two things are associated with each other. So yeah, there are layer upon layer of things to do with the Crossroads. And then, of course, the thinking behind why a crossroads was chosen as a punishment, because that's what it was, if we're blunt about it, taking your own life, to die by suicide for a very long time was considered, a crime. It was a crime against God. It was a crime against nature. These aren't my words. These are, how people felt about it. And so, they thought that you were going to be punished in the afterlife. They thought that you wouldn't go to heaven, you would go to the lower reaches of hell. And they also believed that your spirit would never rest, that your soul would be forever in this kind of purgatory. And so the Crossroads was a punishment in a way, because what we want for ourselves in death is, peace, and to be buried somewhere where there was a constant movement of people and traffic and animals. You are never going to rest in peace buried beneath the Crossroads. But there was also something else going on there as well, which, I think you'll be interested in. And you get an acknowledgement in the book, because you helped me with some of these stories, is that the whole, coming back, your soul never resting. They literally believed that someone who had died by suicide would come back and haunt their communities. So part of the reason that they were buried at the Crossroads appears to be that, they were taking these people away from the community, because these sites were normally on the edges of the parish or on the edges of a village. So you're taking them outside as far as possible. But the idea was also that when the spirit rose, if it was at a crossroads, it would be confused. It wouldn't know which direction it was supposed to go in. And there were also there's a whole raft of sort of mitigating measures that they took to ensure that the spirit couldn't find its way back to haunt the living. So just as a warning to the listeners, some of it is quite unpleasant. So they would do things like bury the person face down, again, so that, I don't know, thinking, but being that they wouldn't be able to rise. They would weight them down. They would put stones on their body. And they would also drive a stake through them, through the body into the ground, almost like pinning the soul in the ground, I suppose. So there was a whole plethora of superstitions around these things.
We started to touch there upon what are known as deviant burials that are often associated with Crossroads burials, and some of the steps taken by people in the past that tied in with their fears and superstitions. A very famous example of this occurred up in London in December of 1811, when the body of a man named John Williams, who had been accused of the Ratcliffe Highway murders, was paraded through the streets before thousands of onlookers, and then at the crossroads between Cannon Street and Cable Street, his body was placed in a hole dug in the road, said to have been 4 foot deep, 3 foot long, and 2 feet wide, so deliberately too small. And then a stake was driven through his heart. It's a pretty macabre scene, and some writers have talked about how these practices could have served as a very deliberate ritual humiliation and casting out of the community, but also perhaps blends with these fears and superstitions that they might rise again to torment the living. Connected with this practice and belief here in Cornwall, we went on to talk about a story from over near Ludgvan, related by Robert Hunt back in the 19th century.
it's slightly folkloric in many ways, but it feeds into this idea of driving a stake through the heart so that they can't rise, or sometimes can't rise on Judgment Day, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so Robert Hunt is the first one that I found to this story, and he published it in his book in the 1880s. But I came across it initially in a newspaper article because I spent a lot of time in the British newspaper archive, just going through and trying to find articles that related to Crossroads burials. And I randomly came across this very bizarre article which talks about a family who are known as spearmen. And you're right, they were from the Ludgvan area. And it talks about how the family got their name. And basically, the long and the short of it is someone had died by suicide. They needed someone to make a spear, to drive through the body. And they also needed someone to do that, and it appears that nobody was very keen on volunteering themselves. And the blacksmith who made the spear, he volunteered his services to be the one that drove the spear through the body, and from then on was known as the Spearman. And that's how this family in the Ludgvan area got their surname, as in like people would be called Baker, if they were the baker, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how true that story is, I couldn't find any sort of corroborating evidence for it. But that, that action, that tradition is fact, that it did happen. And I found references in other places of bodies being pinned to the ground with stakes. So yeah, it's very macabre. But I think what I find interesting about it is those fears that were associated with those kind of deaths. We've spoken about it before, actually. Before I did any of this research, we talked about the ghost layers and about Tucker at Wendron. And, this was what they feared, because Tucker was a man who took his own life, was buried at the Crossroads at Wendron, and then came back to haunt people, and so it was a genuine fear, and you gave me a couple more examples as well. There was the one at Summercourt and the one at Knapp's Corner, just outside Tywardreath. I think the one at Knapp's Corner, that spirit used to jump on people's backs or something, didn't it? If you were walking by. And the one at Summercourt I liked because he was a particular nuisance to ladies. So I'm not really sure what that spirit was up to, but but he was a nuisance. And that one at Summercourt. There's in Summercourt Village, there's 5 roads that all meet, and that I think is the supposed site of the gallows. And the ghost that you gave me the reference to at Summercourt, he was supposedly a murderer who had subsequently been buried. He'd been hung at that crossroads and then buried there, and then come back to cause a nuisance to ladies.
I promise I won't keep interrupting the flow of the conversation too much, but I thought I'd share with you something in reference to the site called Knapp's Corner over at Camborne. David Thomas, in his Ghosts in Camborne Parish back in 1980, wrote, "Knapp's Corner was at the turning down to Bareppa, near the railway bridge at the top of Pendarvis Road, and was haunted by a peculiarly vindictive spirit, which used to leap on people's backs." Interestingly, a while back when I was looking into this local story further, Liz happened to send me a copy of an article in the Cornish Telegraph from back in August of 1851, where they write, "Discovery of human remains. On Wednesday afternoon, August 13th, whilst men were at work on the Camborne branch of the new West Cornwall Railway, they, to their great surprise, discovered the remains of a human body, about 2.5 feet below the surface, consisting of the head, in a fine state of preservation, with the teeth perfect. Spine, leg bones, and shoulder blades. From the appearance of these remains, especially the head, they are supposed to be the remains of a female, about 30 years of age. And the time when the body was deposited there could not be less than 100 years, which partially accounts for the body being there. At that time, coroners' inquests were unknown, and it has been supposed that the deceased had committed suicide, and according to the unusual custom of those days, was buried in Crossroads. It may also be added that the position in which the body was found was where 4 roads crossed each other at acute angles.
It's fascinating, really, because, and I think what draws me to these stories is, for the same reason that I'm often interested in Cornish folklore, is that for me it's trying to tap into that earlier mindset, the way in which people in Cornwall in the past saw the world around them. And I think these stories give examples for me of those fears that people did have, and those earlier beliefs that they had of, that those places you don't want to walk through at night. And this is why. But I guess I'm always, probably like you, trying to find where these stories come from to an extent. And is there a nugget of truth or something that links us back to why these beliefs existed and why that story is told? Is there a past event? Or is it so that we remember something? Is there some kind of morality tale we're supposed to take from it? Or, this is what happens to people who commit these alleged crimes or whatever.
Yeah, and you see, because that's the other aspect of the Crossroads, is that you get the maximum traffic of people who are then being reminded, if you do these things, this is where you'll end up. This is what will happen to you. And in a period when people literally did believe in heaven and hell and being damned for eternity, and that idea was very much part of their daily life in a way that we can't quite understand now, that those things definitely would have had an effect on people, which just actually fills me with sadness that people still, knowing what would happen to them, still took those steps and took their own life. It's, in a way, it's dreadful. Well, of course it's dreadful, not in a way, it's 100% dreadful. So yeah,
I guess for me, again, I'm always fascinated by landscapes, because I think, particularly here in Cornwall, there are so many stories that are, linked to a specific site or particular places in the landscape. And already I'm thinking about it. Well, it's not, I don't say it fulfills the criteria of Crossroads, but all this is reminding me of something that it cropped up in the course of research I was doing for a talk on ghosts in the Cornish landscape last year. But it was actually concerning Castle and Dinas over at St. Column, where it's surrounding a chap called John Tremon. And this stone, I'm not sure if I've found the exact stone. There are a couple of stones, is the problem, in the middle of the site at Castle and Dinas. There's supposed to be this Tremon stone.
Yeah.
And there's this story around real events that we know existed, where this young man, I think he was about 21, in 1671, seems to have murdered 2 young women at St. Column.
Yeah.
And the story is that his punishment was that he was left to starve in this cage at Castle and Dinas. Presumably it's a form of gibbet, but there's this story that there's this Tremon stone, and that's supposed to have been the base on which was his cage. And so you get loads of stories about, if you go round it a certain number of times, you can still hear his chains rattling and all these things. But I guess in that instance, you've got a high up place that's serving as a reminder to everyone all around, because you've got this hill fort, you've got views all around. Presumably, if that cage or whatever it is raised up, the idea is this is supposed to serve as a warning to people. So you've got these, these places that are serving as a warning. But again, what I'm interested in, fascinated in, is you've got this medley sometimes of real events that we know that happened, but you've got this real folklore that develops over the sort of centuries in between. As yet, I haven't managed to find out much more other than the local records for the burial of the two women that he was supposed to have murdered. But I'm trying to
Yeah.
find out if there's any more in the National Archives up at Kew about the size record for what was John Trumann's actual punishment. But as yet, I haven't been able to track it down.
No, that would be very interesting. Yeah, I do know the case. I have looked into it a little bit myself, with the idea. I mean, because it's such it's a like an iconic site in the landscape. It's Iron Age hill fort, to start off with, and then, as you say, they used it latterly as a site for execution, which is not unusual. There are other sort of prehistoric sites connected to, like Hangman's Barrow. That I'm not saying that the execution was exactly, but the reason that it's called Hangman's Barrow is because there was a gibbet near to it. I don't think it was necessarily on it, but at least close by. And again, that site is beside a crossroads, and that crossroads also marks a crossroads of four parishes, again, Crowan, Wendron, Elugan and Camborne, meet at that particular site. So yeah, it is interesting, like these different layers of history on top of each other, and then, as you say, the stories that develop out of that, and they're almost like cautionary tales in a lot of ways, aren't they? Don't do this, else you'll end up in a cage on the top of Castle and Dinus or whatever.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of one that I think I might have mentioned it in a past episode at one point. I think it's known as Robin Long's Grave, or Robert Long's Grave, or Long Robin's Grave. There's little variations, but I think that's near Ruan Lanahorn, and is it Lamorran that way?
Yeah, there's another one not that a million miles away, which is the Bessie Beneath crossroads, and there's a story of I'm trying to think if it's Roger Wakefield or Robert Wakefield, who was Roger Wakefield, and he was a smuggler, and he was also supposedly buried at a crossroads. Oh no, he wasn't initially buried. He was hung in chains at a crossroads, and then obviously when he went a bit gooey, they buried him. And I've wondered in the book, or proposed in the book, that it was the same crossroads as Bessie Beneath. And Bessie Beneath is a whole episode in itself.
Yeah.
And I have spoken about her on my podcast as well. And there's a lot this is one of the things that I think I will add to the book at a later date, is there is a lot of controversy over whether Bessie Beneath actually existed at all. So Bessie, for people that are not familiar with her, is supposedly a real person who was like a highway woman. And I write about her in a lot more detail in the book, but she eventually got caught and was supposedly buried beneath the cottage that is close to this crossroads, hence the Bessie Beneath, because she is beneath the ground. So there's lots. There's something that I think I would like to look into a little bit more in the future, to try and see if I can determine once and for all whether this was a real character or whether this is just folklore that has got itself into a tangle. And but that Roger Wakeman was a real person. He was a smuggler, a bit of a pirate, and he did come to a messy end at a crossroads, close to where we're talking about, on the Roseland.
I wonder I'm always curious with stories like the Bessie Beneath one, when there's so much folklore, whether it's almost like the sort of Robin Hood type thing. You can sort of wonder how much are there real individuals at the heart of these, or the stories are so good, there's such a rich sort of history of people telling these local stories that you wonder, are these part of storytelling traditions, and they've kind of been built on as local draws, local legends. But sometimes the stories are so peculiar and so tied to specific locations that you have to wonder whether there has to be something to do it, because they're so specific, I suppose. But I also wonder with some landscape places about whether sometimes there's a kind of, you wonder what the original place was called before the sort of Ordnance Survey maps.
Yeah.
Whether, someone's gone, well, that sounds like this.
Yeah, see, that's one of the things with Bessie Beneath that I didn't include in the book, but I should have. And that is, there's a theory that the Bessie Beneath is a corruption of an old Cornish name and not connected to a person at all. But it's like all these things that there's, it is open to a lot of interpretation a lot of the time. And like you say, you do wonder, and I often wonder if you get characters that sort of like get lumped in together, so they take a little bit of a story from here and a little bit of a legend from there, and then it all gets mushed in together and becomes one person's story. So was there a highwaywoman that was on the Roseland? Did she get shot? Did she get hung? Was she a witch? There's all these different stories about Bessie. One of them that she was a lady in waiting for one of the Killigrews. There's lots and lots and lots of different stories, and it's all, you wonder if it's all been sort of pulled in together, and whether there's any truth in it at all or not. But the book does have plenty of real stories in it as well, as well as the legendary ones. There are plenty of individuals that I've tried to find out as much as I could about them and their lives, and not just their unfortunate deaths and what happened to them after death. I've tried to find out as much as I could about them, and include that as well, so that they're not just, they're not, most of them aren't remembered at all, and and if they are remembered, it's for how they died, which is obviously very sad. So yeah, I've tried to honor them as best I can, I suppose.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Pisky Trap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode.
I was also just thinking, when it comes to like the sort of Cornish place names thing, and actually on the sort of flip side of that, there's an example that you kind of touched upon, which you talked about actually in blog posts before, but also mentioned in the book, is Camprigny, just outside Truro, and that alludes to a sort of gallows type scenario. But it looks like you found evidence for that being the case at once.
Yes, so it's actually the earliest one that I found. Yeah, so I found a reference to 2 horse thieves that were hung at Caprigny, which is on the Kenwyn side of Truro, basically. And there's still sort of a hill that has Caprigny in the name. But this was in 1283 was the reference I found to that. It was Charles Henderson, actually, the historian, writes about it in one of his essays. So yeah, that I included in the book. I've done a little bit of a timeline which was as much for my own benefit as anybody else's, just trying to work out what happened when and who and how, and because there are sort of signposts or landmarks in this story in a way, because before 1823, it was the law for you to be buried at a crossroads if you had died by suicide. After 1823, the law was changed and it was outlawed. That wasn't allowed to happen, but you still could be buried in consecrated ground, but only at the vicar's discretion. So he could refuse. So then you would have to be buried somewhere on private ground. And it had still to happen at night. And that was another one of the sort of long-standing traditions, is that traditionally anyone who had died by suicide was buried at Crossroads, but between 9 and midnight. So it had to be sort of after dark. And that remained the law, or in law, until 1880. So it was 60 years. That continued to be part of it. And I think it was 1882 or 3, where the buried at night part of it was actually removed. That was sort of eased. And as well, on top of that, is you weren't allowed any Christian rites. There couldn't be a service, that you weren't supposed to have any kind of singing of hymns or anything like that. And that was then eased but not until the 1880s. It continued right up until then to be outlawed, I suppose.
When you were kind of putting all of this together, kind of bringing the research together and all these things, were there kind of particular ones that that sort of stood out to you, or you would kind of, it sounds odd to kind of say particular favorites, but do you know what I mean?
There were a lot of stories that really, understandably, I think, upset me or moved me, I suppose. And there are several that I just found particularly curious. I suppose it's a real sort of insight into human behavior in a lot of ways. So alongside the Crossroads burials, I also sort of touch upon other superstitions around death. And, so things like people wanting a piece of the hangman's rope, for example, thinking that was good luck. There were strange accounts of people, being touched by a dead man's hand would cure you of certain ailments. And then there was a particular story of a man who died by suicide in Penzance, that when I was researching it, I just thought how bizarre it was. So he hung himself from a tree, and it was actually located where the rugby ground in Penzance is now. And that was just fields at that time. There was nothing there at all, no houses or anything. It was at the outside of the town. And he hung himself from this tree. And then in the days and weeks following his death, souvenir hunters started coming to that tree and pulling off bark, pulling off branches, chunks of the wood, to the point where the tree, either, according to different accounts, either the tree collapsed, because it was just being pulled to pieces, or they removed it because it had become so dangerous from the amount of people that were. It's just so bizarre to me. What would motivate you? But there was this weird connection between death and good luck, or it's just odd behavior. And I talk about other similar kind of reactions to people who have died by suicide. Yeah, especially in sort of later in the Victorian period. I go into some quite odd actions by the general public that sort of get caught up in this weird sort of fever around these deaths. Is really quite bizarre. But there were other circumstances. There were I talked a minute ago about the changes in the law, but what I've tried to emphasize is that there were vicars, particularly in rural areas like Cornwall, because this wasn't just a Cornish thing, this was nationwide. I've just obviously been, obsessed with local history, I've focused on Cornwall, but Crossroads burials was a national thing. But particularly in rural areas, the vicars, the clergy, took a while to come around to the idea of having these people, as they would put it, buried in consecrated ground in their churchyards. And some of the stories that I relate in the book are about vicars that were turning coffins away at the church gates and, shunning these people and talking about in the newspapers, talking about how, if they allow them to be buried in consecrated ground, they'll be, giving a sort of a bad impression to the community and taking it too lightly. And some of that, really kind of upset me quite a bit, just to read how these men of the cloth were behaving, should we put it like that?
Yeah, this sort of holding on to older ideas. I suppose ideas do take time to sort of change, and there can be, some who kind of resist those changes. So it's sad to think that those ideas did continue. But I mean, I've come across newspaper articles from the sort of 1840s, 1850s, where people are speaking in public about how they can't believe that there used to be this most barbarous practice of burying people at a crossroads, but it's only within a generation, 20 odd years before or something like that, it was still going on. So it's weird how at the same time you get this real shift in the Victorian period, particularly, of people going, how on earth, did that happen? But you've also got along with that sort of Victorian fascination with death. And when you were talking about the sort of death superstitions, it reminded me of a couple of things. I think Robert Hunt talks about, again, sort of the superstitions in West Cornwall around kissing or touching the hand of someone who's taken their own life. And also, I'm going to try and find it. I did find an example of someone who was talking about their recollections from being a child in the 19th century in Penzance, and they remember as a child, because they were ill, being taken to visit the body of someone who'd recently died, I can't remember if it's to kiss or touch the body as a cure. I'll try and find out, but I think I managed to find out who that person would have been who had died.
Yeah.
It was at St Mary's in Penzance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird, but again, it taps into this mindset. But William Painter also talks about, because it came up when I was doing a talk on Cornish witchcraft. He mentions, I think it's about 1930s, talking about how there were 4 pellars working out of Callington, but one of them could strike for the king's evil, which is scrofula.
Yeah.
And they had in their possession a piece of rope which had hanged someone at Launceston.
Yeah.
It had been about at least 100 years before, because that last hanging there was, I think, 1821. But these superstitions and practices around touching the piece of rope that had hanged someone were clearly still alive and well in 1930. So it makes you think about how long some of these ideas kind of continued for as well.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. I mean, that change in attitude was what resulted, a change in public attitude was what resulted in the change of the law in 1823. And I think that that's sort of the precursor to that was the Grills Act, the Burial of Drowned Persons Act of 1810. And it all sort of feeds into the same thing. So that for those that don't know, that outlawed the burial of drowned bodies on the coast. So, and that came out of the wreck of the Anson. Grills was, a Helston man who witnessed this disastrous wreck at Low Bar. And he also witnessed the mass burial of people, in a pit, basically, on the coast, and just thought, this is barbaric. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. And that's what led to the Grills Act, or, in 1810. And I think, 13 years later, when it was out, Crossroads burials were obviously outlawed as well. It was a change in the public's perception, or the public's sort of, they were no longer comfortable with what was happening, understandably. But for those that came before, my lady that was buried at the four parishes stone, she was 10 years before the law changed, when it was just what happened, which is mind-boggling to us now. But it was just what was done, and it's dreadful to think, for how many hundreds of years that was just the accepted way that things were done.
But another one that really stood out to me, which you mentioned in the book, is the Sir James Tilley story. Because now we're into the kind of deviant burials, but sometimes they're at someone's request.
Yes, yeah. So this was a sort of an offshoot, I suppose, of my research, is that I started to come across individuals who, for various reasons, had decided that they didn't want to be buried in the churchyard like everybody else. They had their own ideas, of various degrees of weirdness. And I think James Tilley is right up there with the weird. It's quite an odd story. And it's one of those ones that when you first read it, you're like, nah, that's not real. Yeah, so Sir James Tilley, he is a fascinating character. He really came from quite a humble background and just worked his way up the social ladder, I suppose, and ended up dying a very, very wealthy man, living in Pentilly Castle, which is right up on the Tamar River. And when he died, he left some very specific instructions in his will. And there are a lot of theories about why he might have done this that I go into a bit in the book. But he basically built himself, before he passed, he built himself a mausoleum, which is not that unusual, especially for landed families to have, their own plots or their own mausoleums. But he built this mausoleum overlooking the Tamar River. It's a stunning spot. If you get the opportunity to visit Pentilly, they are open as a hotel, and they a few times a year they do like open days, like public events that you can go along and visit the gardens and do different things and have a walk around. So if you get the opportunity, definitely do it, because I when I was researching this story, managed to go and visit the gardens as well and go and look at this mausoleum. And it is a sight to behold. It really is. I mean, it's huge to start off with. And then there is a life-sized statue of James Pentilly seated in a chair in this mausoleum. Now, the instructions that he left in his will were that there was to be no religious service for him, and that his body was to be dressed in its finest clothes, with his gloves and his hat, and of course at that period his wig as well. And he was to be seated in his favorite chair, with his arms and legs bound to the chair to keep him in an upright position. And he was to be bricked up inside this mausoleum, along with load of his books, pen and ink, his tobacco and pipe, and portraits of him and himself on his wife and himself on the wall, and that a servant was to bring him food every day, his body food every day, for a period, I think it was 2 years. Because, he said in the will that he was under the impression that he was going to be resurrected. And obviously, once you've woke up from being dead, you're probably going to be a little bit peckish. So he wanted to make sure he had a snack. Now, this was like common knowledge that this had happened. But everyone kind of, I think, believed that it was a bit sort of tongue in cheek, you know what I mean? That you know, he had put this stuff in his will, but I don't think anyone really 100% believed that it was actually carried out as per his wishes. But an excavation was done. The mausoleum needed repair in 2012. And at the same time, they took the opportunity to have some archaeologists come and do a little bit of an excavation. And what they discovered was a sort of a hidden crypt underneath a flagstone floor, in which there was a skeleton and the remains of a wooden, or what appeared to be a wooden chair. So it was sort of then decided that, oh, in actual fact, it appears that his wishes were carried out. They didn't remove the bones; that it was all just sealed up again. So he is still there, as he wished, beneath the floor of his mausoleum. So yeah, quite a bizarre little episode.
It's amazing, really, and it's so eccentric and off the wall. It reminds me of sort of the idea of Egyptian tombs and the sort of, you know, of them being decorated with all the things they had in life and things like that. And you kind of wonder just what, you know, what sparked that idea, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's some theories. One of them being that he genuinely did think that he was going to be resurrected. But another one, which I quite enjoy, is someone that actually knew him in life was interviewed, and their sort of comments appeared in the newspaper. It was the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette in 1827. Now, obviously, they were very elderly, because, you know, that's a long time after his death. But whoever it was claimed to have known him in life. And they said that he was a man of wit, who enjoyed a good jest, and that they believed that he was kind of lampooning religion, that he was not a religious man, and he was sort of making fun in a way of Christian beliefs, and that his final wishes were just sort of like the joke's on you kind of a thing, you know, that he was just ridiculing those around him. So yeah.
I love that. I think it really gives you a sense of character, and you kind of, it's one of those instances you go, you'd love to have been able to sit and have a conversation and go, what was that about?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what was motivating you?
Definitely.
Yeah. The other one that I enjoy, because I came, like I said, there was several of these sort of deviant burials, people that were buried in sort of random places. And the other one that we should mention briefly is James Hoskin, who again is one of these really fascinating characters, like you say, that you would like to be able to have a cup of tea with and just go, so, because he was a farmer, but he was also a diarist, and he traveled to America in 1810 and wrote a book of his travels, basically, which is still in print. You can read it. And he seems quite a sort of eccentric character, I suppose, quite a complicated character. He was very political, had quite a complicated private life as well. He had a wife and several children, but in the last few years of his life, he went to live with another woman, a younger woman. But he infamously had a disagreement with the vicar of Ludgvan. And this rift went on for several years and was quite nasty. And no one's entirely sure what it was about. There's an idea that it was over non-payment of tithes to the church. There's also thinking that he had several children that passed away quite young. And there's one theory that he got into an argument with the vicar over the headstone for one of the children. And then the one that I quite enjoy is that he was caught kissing the vicar's wife, and that was why they fell out. So the vicar was Reverend John Stevens, and Stevens made his dislike of Hoskin very, very clear. And he is actually said to have told Hoskin, if you die before I do, I'm going to bury you in the worst part of the churchyard. You're going to be in the top corner, the north side of church, which apparently is the least popular side in Cornwall, beside the privy, beside the toilet. And Hoskin was so put out, he's like, I can't that can't happen. So in order to sort of escape that, he went and bought himself a plot of land up along Castle and Dinas, and made his own sort of like little graveyard up there for him and his wife and his children to be buried in. And he was actually buried up there. He had to be moved, though, quite a long time later, about 100 years later, I think, because the quarry was sort of gradually making its way closer and closer and closer to where he was buried, and so he was moved in the end. But and his wife didn't follow him. She got buried in the churchyard.
That's just too far. I'm not getting involved with that.
Yeah, you're all right. Plus the fact he'd been living with another woman at the end of their, married life. So, I mean, I found the research for this book just endlessly fascinating. I mean, yes, many of the stories are incredibly sad, but as you say, just trying to understand their perspective and trying to get into their heads and the thinking of the time. Yeah, it's just endlessly fascinating.
Is that something, or I suppose the question would be, what would you like readers of the book to kind of take away from it? What would you kind of like them to come away thinking? Would you like them to kind of start to think about these places differently, or?
Yeah, I guess I don't want people to go around the landscape feeling depressed and sad about it, but I suppose ultimately I want these people to be remembered, is what it boils down to. I think I was just so sort of shocked and upset myself to think that there were all these burials that people had, myself included, had no idea existed, and how sad that was, that they were shunned in their lifetime and shunned after death, and then shunned by history, completely forgotten. I suppose, that's what I would like people to take away, is just to, for a moment, spare a thought for those people.
That was my recent conversation with Elizabeth Dale. A big thank you to Elizabeth for taking the time to chat, and I highly recommend checking out her book, Buried at the Crossroads, which is available now. And I'll pop a link in the show notes to where you can get yourself a copy. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it and you found it interesting. We'll be back again very soon to explore another local topic. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.